Burma, also known as Myanmar, has been in the international spotlight the past few weeks for its democratic elections following half a century of oppressive, corrupt, and authoritarian military rule. The figurehead of the Burmese democratic movement, Aung San Suu Kyi, and her party, the National League for Democracy, won a majority in parliament the other week. On the backdrop of these historic elections is increasing violence targeting an ethnic minority of Muslims, called the Rohingya, which the UN has called one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. A precarious balance of interests amongst over a dozen armed ethnic groups also threatens stability in the country. The democratic transition in Burma serves to reconfigure control over the national interests and the national dialogue, exacerbating tensions amongst certain groups and easing tensions amongst others. Citizenship in Burma is based off of centuries-old racial profiling by British colonialists, which has since been embraced and upheld by Burmese statemakers. The 1982 citizenship law outlines a list of 135 national races that belong to the state and are thus granted citizenship. This list of races is derived from British census reports dating back to 1823. Those races and ethnicities that have textual evidence of having been present in the territory at this time are assumed to be the original Burmese people who inhabited the territory before colonial rule. What is ignored in this identification is that the inflexible and permanent racial categories imposed by the British were incredibly flexible prior to British rule. The British census and identification cards served to entrench these ethnic categories as singular and permanent identity markers, which Burmese statemakers have since used to construct a long-standing and exclusive national narrative. As a consequence of the 1982 citizenship law, several ethnic groups that lack the hard evidence to prove their place in the Burmese historical myth are denied citizenship. The most prominent amongst these groups are the Rohingya, an ethnic group of over 1 million Bengali Muslims who live in the western Rakhine state. Though there are reports of Muslims living in this area for centuries, and despite claims from the Rohingya of deep ancestry in the state, the fact that the name Rohingya does not appear until the 20th century, and reports of Bangladeshi immigrants crossing the border in more recent times, leads the government to deny them citizenship and leads Burmese nationalists to refer to the Rohingya as illegal immigrants. Since the Rohingya are not recognized as a legitimate national race, they are only included on the census as resident foreigners, or as Bengalis, and are denied citizenship cards and other documentation granted to citizens. As a result, the Rohingya are a stateless people and lack the benefits of citizenship, such as free movement, access to higher education, banking, healthcare, and military protection. They also lack the necessary paperwork to apply for other forms of citizenship. In the past decade, anti-Rohingya and anti-Muslim sentiment has been boiling over, mostly in Rakhine State, where nationalists deny their place in the Burmese nation. A group of Buddhist nationalists, called the 969 movement, and led by a monk named Waratu, who has been nicknamed the Burmese Bin Laden, have led the charge against the Rohingya, spreading anti-Muslim propaganda and often inciting physical violence and driving the Rohingya out of their homes.
Buddhist mobs, often including monks, have rampaged, leaving many dead and Muslim communities living in fear.
This one is of Rakhine State.
Yes.
As we look around the monastery, Waratu shows me some posters outside his classroom. They show the victims of violent clashes between Buddhists and Muslims. These were the scenes in western Myanmar last year. The rape and murder of a Buddhist woman triggered violence between the Buddhist population and local Muslims, known as Rohingya, who are stateless under Burmese law. As the security forces looked on, and sometimes participated, at least 150 people, most of them Muslim, were killed, and more than 100,000 driven from their homes. Waratu's posters only show the Buddhist victims of the violence.
Horrific pictures, really shocking.
Most of the images are just too gruesome for us to show.
အဓိကကတော့အမျိုးဘာသာသာသနာကိုကာကွယ်ဆောက်ရှောက်ဖို့ပါပဲတကယ်လို့ဒါကိုမျိုးကိုလူမျိုးကိုမဆောက်ရှောက်လို့ကိုလူမျိုးကအင်အားနည်းသွားရင်နောက်တစ်ချိန်မှာသူများလူအင်အားများတဲ့အခါဒီလိုပဲအတုံးအယုံတည်ကြလိမ့်မယ်အဲဒါကြောင့်လူဦးရေကိုထိန်းချုပ်ကိုလူဦးရေကိုရော့မသွားအောင်ထိန်းနိုင်မှုတတိပေးတာပါ
While the anti-Rohingya sentiment can be blamed on antiquated perceptions of race in Burma and a growing Rohingya population, the increase in sectarian violence, as shown in this video, can be seen in part as an attempt to maintain control over the national narrative amidst a democratic transition and a growing Rohingya population. It is also important to note that there are many Buddhists, including many of those who fought for democracy in the Saffron Revolution, who oppose the 969 movement and the extremist tactics of the nationalists. Though the Rohingya are a small minority in the country, in Rakhine State they make up 40% of the population, against the 60% of ethnic Rakhine. If the Rohingya were to achieve citizenship and vote in democratic elections, the influence of these people, who nationalists consider to be illegal immigrants, would pose a legitimate political threat to the ethnic Rakhine population. For those who hold on to the myth of a historical Burmese nation with strict ethnic boundaries, the nation is threatened by the possibility of those they consider outsiders to assert political power proportional to their population. The inflexible and historically embedded racial categories encased in the census and on identity cards make it easy for nationalists to distinguish between the Burmese citizen and the Rohingya foreigner or outsider. The section at the bottom of this card, stating that nationality is not evidence that the holder is of that country, was not included until the 1982 citizenship law, and is sometimes referred to as a persecution or discrimination key. A minority of Christians also face discrimination in Burma. These stickers have been used to distinguish Buddhist businesses so as to direct other Buddhists away from Muslim businesses and further polarize the two populations. Where mutually exclusive national narratives exist, such as that between the Rohingya and the Buddhist nationalists, democracy serves to institutionalize a competition between the proponents of these two histories. This is shown in recent political moves to target the Muslims, such as recent laws that were passed to limit the frequency of childbirth, prohibit interfaith marriages and religious conversions, and to enforce monogamy. These laws are clearly a response to a growing Muslim population and an attempt to keep the two mutually exclusive ideas of Burmese nationalism separate. In their campaign trails, some political candidates rallied support by taunting the Rohingya and vowing action against them, thus heightening existing tensions for political popularity. The Rohingya's lack of citizenship, and thus the right to vote, also robs him of any political leverage in a democracy, and removes political incentive for representatives to address their plight. In addition to the ethnic conflict between the Rohingya and the Buddhist nationalists, there are roughly 16 different armed ethnic groups throughout the country, whose skirmishes with the central government since independence have left thousands dead and over 100,000 displaced. The authoritarian rule of the ethnic Bamar-led military in the past half-century has led these ethnic minorities to demand autonomy under a federal system of government. Whereas a democratic transition in Burma may serve to exacerbate the tensions over citizenship and population for the Rohingya, the breakdown of the centralized and authoritarian military state may serve to ease the tensions amongst other ethnic groups that felt underrepresented under the Bamar-led centralized government. While the democratic transition has helped achieve a ceasefire agreement amongst armed ethnic groups, the government, including Aung San Suu Kyi, remain almost entirely silent on the issue of the stateless and persecuted Rohingya. Spectators do not predict that the Rohingya's situation will get any worse than it is, but they also do not predict that it will get any better. The future of the Rohingya and the continued progress towards peace amongst the armed ethnic groups in Burma will probably depend on the stability of the government following the recent elections, as well as the international pressure placed on the government to address these issues.